I discovered that my mother was showing photos of my family to neighbors with false stories about neglect. 12 people had already heard her distorted version. When I found my mother Helena at neighbor Mariana's house, showing photos of my children in winter clothes while inventing detailed stories about me, letting them go cold without adequate warm clothing during freezing days with below 0 temperatures, I instantly realized that this was neither the first nor second incident of systematic defamation that she had methodically executed against my maternal reputation throughout the entire neighborhood for weeks or possibly months without my knowledge. Mariana, everything Helena just told you during the last hour is completely false and intentionally fabricated to destroy my reputation as a mother, I declared with growing firmness while recovering my composure after the initial shock of discovering the extent of the lies that my own mother was systematically spreading throughout the neighborhood. My children have more than adequate winter clothes that we bought at the beginning of the cold season, precisely to ensure they were protected against low temperatures. Fernando and I maintain healthy family finances without any addictions or irresponsible spending. And most importantly, we have never deprived Gabriel and Sophia of any basic necessity, including adequate food, appropriate clothing, regular medical care, and a safe and loving home environment. The words came out of my mouth with absolute conviction, based on direct knowledge about the objective reality of my family life. But simultaneously, I painfully understood that this unilateral declaration of innocence would probably not be sufficient to completely undo the reputational damage already caused by Helena's elaborate narratives during private sessions with neighbors who had no prior reason to doubt an apparently concerned grandmother sharing distressing information about the well-being of vulnerable grandchildren. Helena remained seated on the couch observing this confrontation with an expression that mixed calculated defiance and mainly disturbing satisfaction about having managed to create an impossible situation where any attempt of mine to refute false accusations could be interpreted as defensive behavior of a guilty person trying to hide inconvenient truths instead of an innocent victim legitimately outraged about malicious defamation. Julia, you can deny reality in front of Mariana today, but I have personally witnessed for months the concerning conditions in which my grandchildren live when I visit your house without warning beforehand, giving you time to hide evidence of neglect. Helena counter attacked with a tone that combined false maternal concern with implicit accusation that I was blatantly lying about the family situation to protect my public image, instead of admitting real problems that required intervention from extended family and possibly appropriate authorities. The mention of unannounced visits to my house during previous months revealed that Helena's systematic campaign against my maternal reputation had begun long before that moment of direct confrontation at Mariana's house, and mainly suggested that she had been systematically collecting details about normal family routines that she later maliciously distorted, transforming perfectly benign everyday aspects into fabricated evidence of serious neglect. The sophisticated manipulation was absolutely shocking in its calculated elaboration. Helena wasn't simply spreading vague rumors based on innocent misunderstandings, but rather executing an orchestrated defamation campaign that involved systematic observation, collection of photographs and contextual details, and mainly construction of elaborate false narratives that sounded convincing to audiences who didn't possess direct knowledge about the objective reality of my family life. Helena, if you genuinely had concerns about your grandchildren's well-being, why did you never talk to me directly about these issues instead of spreading false stories to the entire neighborhood without giving me an opportunity to respond or clarify misunderstandings? I asked with a voice that began to tremble from the growing emotion in face of such profound and deliberate maternal betrayal. Responsible grandparents who truly care about grandchildren talk to parents first trying to understand situations before making serious public accusations that permanently destroy reputations and family relationships. Helena's response was a cold smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes, revealing that her actions weren't based on genuine concern, but rather on something much more sinister and deliberately malicious that I still couldn't fully comprehend, despite witnessing direct evidence of her manipulations. Mariana watched this family confrontation with growing discomfort, obviously realizing that she had possibly been deceived during the last hour of apparently sincere conversation with Helena, but simultaneously not possessing sufficient information to definitively determine which version of reality was true. The detailed allegations of a concerned grandmother presented during a prolonged private session, or the vehement denials of a daughter confronted unexpectedly, who would naturally defend her reputation against serious accusations regardless of truthfulness. Julia, Helena, There's obviously a serious disagreement between you about a family situation that clearly won't be resolved here in my living room today. Mariana finally intervened with a diplomatic tone, trying to extract herself from the uncomfortable position of involuntary arbiter in a complex family conflict. Perhaps you should resolve these issues privately, or possibly with help from a professional family mediator, instead of continuing to argue in front of neighbors who don't have the complete context necessary to evaluate conflicting claims. Mariana's reasonable suggestion about resolving the conflict privately completely ignored the crucial fact that Helena had deliberately made this family dispute public through a systematic defamation campaign involving multiple neighbors over an extended period, and mainly that the reputational damage already caused couldn't simply be erased through subsequent private conversations between mother and daughter, because rumors once spread tend to persist indefinitely in small communities regardless of subsequent refutations. I urgently needed to discover the complete extent of the damage caused by Helena by identifying all the neighbors who had been exposed to the false narratives during weeks or months prior to that confrontation, and mainly needed to develop a comprehensive strategy to repair my reputation through proactive communications, clarifying the objective truth before rumors solidified into unquestionable convictions in the neighborhood's collective consciousness. Mariana, I thank you for allowing me to enter when I arrived, unexpectedly interrupting a conversation that obviously wasn't meant for my ears. I responded, maintaining a respectful tone despite the impossible situation. Before I leave, I need to ask directly. Did Helena mention having shared these concerns about maternal neglect with other people in the neighborhood besides you? I need to know the extent of the reputational damage that was caused by her false stories, so I can correct it appropriately through clarifying conversations with all the people who were deceived. Mariana visibly hesitated, uncomfortable about revealing information that Helena had shared during a presumably confidential private conversation, but finally decided that transparency was the appropriate response considering the severity of the allegations involved, and mainly my right to know who had been exposed to defamatory accusations about my maternal capacity. Julia, during our conversation today, Helena mentioned that she had already talked to at least 11 other people in the neighborhood about her concerns related to your children's well-being. Mariana revealed with an expression that mixed guilt about having participated even involuntarily in the dissemination of potentially false information, and mainly relief about finally being able to share information that had been bothering her conscience since the initial moments of the conversation with Helena. She specifically mentioned having talked to Carmem, who lives next to you, Ricardo across the street, besides several other families who frequent the same supermarket and pharmacy that you use regularly, and mainly indicated that she was planning to eventually contact appropriate authorities if the family situation didn't improve according to her standards. The revelation that at least 12 people, including Mariana, had already been exposed to Helena's defamatory narratives, and mainly that she was considering involving Child Protective Services in a campaign of systematic lies, transformed the situation from a private family conflict into a serious reputational crisis with potentially devastating consequences that could include official investigations of neglect based exclusively on false accusations from a malicious person. The absolute shock of discovering that Helena had systematically contacted 12 different neighbors during an extended period, building an elaborate defamation campaign instead of simply making isolated casual comments to one or two people, revealed a level of premeditation and malice that completely transcended any explanation based on genuine maternal concern or innocent misunderstandings about observed situations. People legitimately concerned about children's well-being talk directly to parents first, and only involve third parties or authorities after frustrated attempts at private resolution through constructive dialogue. They definitely don't start by executing a systematic public campaign of reputational destruction, involving 12 different people before even mentioning concerns directly to the supposedly negligent person. Helena, I need you to explain to me right now why you chose to spread elaborate lies about maternal neglect to at least 12 different neighbors instead of simply talking to me directly about any real concerns you might have about Gabriel and Sophia. I demanded with a voice that finally allowed growing fury to overflow through the facade of controlled composure that I had maintained until that moment. Grandparents who genuinely care about grandchildren don't orchestrate public defamation campaigns designed to destroy parents' reputations. They talk honestly, offer constructive help, and mainly protect family relationships instead of deliberately sabotaging them through calculated lies. Helena observed my emotional outburst with that particular expression of cold satisfaction that revealed I was reacting exactly as she had anticipated and possibly even planned. Make serious accusations publicly. Wait until being directly confronted by the victim. and then use the natural emotional reaction as additional evidence of supposed problematic behavior that would validate the original false narratives in the perception of audiences witnessing the confrontation without complete context. Julia, you're proving exactly what I've been telling the neighborhood about your explosive temper and inability to accept constructive criticism about your problematic maternal choices. Helena responded with calculated calm that deliberately contrasted with my growing emotional agitation. Any responsible grandmother has not only the right, but the moral obligation to protect vulnerable grandchildren when she observes concerning patterns of neglect by parents who clearly aren't adequately prioritizing child welfare. And if that means seeking support and witnesses through the community before eventually involving appropriate authorities, then that's completely justified action based on genuine love for innocent children who can't defend themselves alone against irresponsible adults. Helena's audacious reframing characterizing a systematic campaign of malicious defamation as simply the actions of a responsible grandmother protecting vulnerable grandchildren was sophisticated rhetorical manipulation designed to make external audiences, like Mariana witnessing that confrontation, interpret the situation through a lens favorable to Helena, instead of recognizing her behavior as obviously malicious and unjustifiable. I breathed deeply, trying to recover the composure I had momentarily lost in face of Helena's calculated provocation, recognizing that continuing to engage emotionally in that confrontation would only serve her manipulative purposes of portraying me as an unstable and aggressive person, incapable of responding calmly to legitimate concerns. Mariana, I thank you for being honest with me about the extent of the conversations Helena had with neighbors. And mainly, I apologize for having transformed your living room into the scene of an unpleasant family confrontation that you certainly didn't expect to witness when you invited my mother for coffee this afternoon, I said, with a more controlled tone while mentally preparing for the next steps necessary in the reputational damage control strategy. I'm going to leave now and allow you to finish your conversation, but soon I'll be contacting you and all the other 11 people Helena mentioned to present my version of reality, including objective evidence that completely refutes the false accusations that were made against my maternal capacity during the systematic defamation campaign that my own mother maliciously executed for motivations I still don't fully understand. I turned to leave the room without waiting for any additional response from Helena or Mariana, but before I reached the front door, I heard Helena's voice calling out with a tone that mixed defiance and especially a veiled threat about the consequences of continuing to deny the reality of her concerns. Julia, you can try to convince the neighbors that I'm a malicious liar making up stories about negligence that doesn't exist, but eventually the truth always emerges through accumulated observations from multiple independent sources that will confirm everything I've been saying about the concerning conditions my grandchildren are living in under your inadequate care. I completely ignored Helena's final provocation and quickly left Mariana's house, walking with accelerated steps down the sidewalk toward my own house located just 3 blocks away. My mind frantically processing all the devastating implications of what I had just discovered, and especially developing urgent plans to mitigate reputational damage before it became irreversible through the solidification of rumors into collective community convictions. When I finally reached the familiar safety of my own house, I closed the front door, creating a temporary physical barrier between myself and that hostile neighborhood that now contained at least 12 people who had been systematically exposed to elaborate false narratives about my alleged serious maternal failures, and I immediately called Fernando at work, urgently reporting everything I had just discovered about Helena's defamation campaign. Fernando remained in shocked silence during the first few minutes, while I detailed the impossible scene at Mariana's house, and finally responded with a mixture of absolute disbelief and especially growing fury that my own mother had deliberately chosen to destroy our family reputation through systematic lies, instead of simply talking to us about any genuine concerns she might have. Julia, your mother systematically contacted 12 different neighbors over an extended period, spreading elaborate stories about maternal negligence, including specific false allegations about us letting Gabriel and Sophia go cold without adequate clothing, and especially mentioned planning to eventually involve Child Protective Services. Fernando summarized with a controlled but obviously anger-laden voice. What kind of psychologically maladjusted grandmother orchestrates such a systematic and cruel campaign, specifically designed to destroy her own daughter's reputation through serious allegations of child neglect that could result in traumatic official investigations for the entire family, including the very children she claims to be protecting? Fernando's rhetorical question echoed exactly the same questions that had dominated my mind during the hurried walk back home, trying to understand possible motivations for such bizarre and deliberately malicious behavior on Helena's part. Fernando, I need you to come home immediately because we need to develop an urgent strategy to control reputational damage before rumors spread even further through the neighborhood. I requested, with growing urgency. I'm going to start by calling Carmen, our immediate neighbor whom Helena specifically mentioned contacting. And I'll request an emergency meeting still today to clarify the objective truth before her false narratives solidify into unquestionable convictions. Fernando immediately agreed to leave work early, returning home within an hour, and while I waited for his arrival, I began executing the first phase of the damage control plan by calling Carmen requesting an urgent conversation about a delicate family matter that required immediate clarification before misunderstandings caused additional damage to neighborhood relationships we had carefully built over 5 years living in that community. Carmen, I need to talk to you urgently about some stories my mother Helena has been spreading through the neighborhood involving serious false allegations about maternal negligence that are destroying my reputation as a mother. I explained quickly when Carmen answered the phone after 2 rings. I know she talked to you recently about alleged concerns related to my children's well-being, and I need an opportunity to present my version of reality, including objective evidence that completely refutes the false accusations that were made during a systematic defamation campaign that I still don't fully understand, but that I need to stop immediately before it causes irreversible damage. Carmen remained briefly silent, processing my urgent request, and when she finally responded, her tone of voice revealed a mixture of discomfort about being dragged into the middle of a family conflict, and especially growing curiosity about finally hearing the perspective of the person who had been the subject of concerning conversations with Helena during the previous week. Julia, your mother really did talk to me 5 days ago, showing me some photographs of your children and explaining that she was worried about certain situations she observed when she visited your house. Carmen confirmed cautiously. I won't lie and say the conversation didn't leave me worried about the possibility of Gabriel and Sophia living in less adequate conditions than they appeared during casual interactions we have on the street. But I always felt I should hear your version before forming definitive opinions about a complex family situation that I obviously don't fully understand, based only on unilateral reports from third parties, even if it's your own mother. Carmen's honest response offered some hope that at least some of the 12 people contacted by Helena maintained healthy skepticism about serious accusations instead of simply passively accepting narratives presented as unquestionable truths. I scheduled a meeting with Carmen for that same afternoon after Fernando arrived home, and during the following hour, I methodically prepared a complete dossier of objective evidence refuting each specific allegation Helena had made, including dated photographs showing Gabriel and Sophia wearing appropriate winter clothing during recent weeks, bank statements demonstrating healthy family financial management without irresponsible spending that would justify concerns about inadequate prioritization of children's needs, and especially regular pediatric medical records confirming that both children were perfectly healthy and well cared for, as attested by an independent medical professional during routine annual checkups. When Fernando finally arrived home, he found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of documents systematically organized into categories corresponding to different specific false allegations Helena had made during her defamation campaign. Julia, you've gathered impressive evidence categorically refuting all the accusations your mother made. But we need to realistically recognize that objective documentation alone probably won't be sufficient to completely undo the reputational damage already caused, because rumors about child neglect tend to persist in people's memories even after being refuted through contrary evidence, Fernando warned with characteristic pragmatism while reviewing the documentation I had prepared. In addition to presenting this evidence to the 12 people your mother contacted, we need to consider taking formal legal action against Helena for malicious defamation that could have serious consequences, including traumatic official investigations by Child Protective Services authorities, if she eventually follows through on her threat to contact them based on completely false accusations. Fernando's suggestion about initiating legal proceedings against my own mother created devastating internal emotional conflict, where part of me recognized the practical necessity of protecting the family through formal legal measures, while another part felt profound resistance about transforming a family conflict into a public legal case that would create permanent and irreparable divisions in the extended family. During the subsequent meeting with Carmen that afternoon, I methodically presented all the objective evidence refuting Helena's specific allegations, while Fernando complemented technical explanations about financial and medical documents that categorically proved that Gabriel and Sophia lived in a completely healthy and appropriate family environment without any negligence or deprivation of basic needs. Carmen observed the complete presentation in attentive silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific chronology or interpretation of particular documents. And when we finally finished the exhaustive presentation, she breathed deeply, as if mentally processing all the conflicting information she had received during the last week. First, Helena's concerning narratives during a private conversation, and now detailed refutation supported by substantial documentary evidence presented by Fernando and me. Julia, Fernando, I appreciate you taking the time to present me with all this information, and especially for treating the situation with appropriate seriousness, recognizing that rumors about child neglect are extremely serious regardless of truthfulness. Carmen finally responded with a more conciliatory tone. Based on the evidence you presented today, it seems clear that Helena significantly distorted normal situations, transforming benign everyday aspects into serious allegations of neglect that definitely don't reflect the objective reality of your family life, as demonstrated through the medical, financial, and photographic documentation we reviewed extensively during the last hour. Carmen's validation of the falsity of Helena's allegations offered substantial relief, but didn't completely eliminate concern about the other 11 people who still needed to be contacted individually for similar presentations of evidence, refuting the defamatory narratives they had received during private conversations with my mother during previous weeks. The following weeks were dedicated to methodically executing the damage control strategy by systematically visiting each of the 12 people identified by Mariana as having been contacted by Helena, presenting the complete dossier of objective evidence, and especially requesting that they share clarifications about the objective truth with other people in the neighborhood, instead of allowing false rumors to continue circulating without contestation, through informal community communication networks that connected neighbors through casual conversations about local matters, inevitably including gossip about resident families. During that exhausting process of reputational reconstruction, I discovered additional disturbing details about the extent and sophistication of Helena's defamation campaign. She had apparently prepared different personalized narratives for different audiences based on specific vulnerabilities or particular concerns of each neighbor, demonstrating a level of calculated psychological manipulation that completely transcended any explanation based on genuine maternal concern, distorted by innocent misunderstandings. For Mariana, who was a single mother struggling financially, Helena had emphasized allegations about financial irresponsibility and frivolous spending instead of prioritizing children's needs. For Ricardo, who was an overprotective father obsessed with safety, Helena had emphasized allegations about inadequate supervision and exposing children to unnecessary risks. For other neighbors, Helena had adapted narratives highlighting different aspects of alleged maternal negligence based on psychological profiles she had apparently studied during months of systematic observation, preparing the groundwork for the eventual defamation campaign. The discovery about the level of premeditation and personalization of Helena's lies made it impossible to continue rationalizing her behavior as simply the result of distorted maternal concern or innocent misunderstandings. This was clearly an orchestrated campaign of reputational destruction, executed with psychological sophistication suggesting deliberate malice instead of genuine confusion about observed situations. Fernando and I finally made the difficult decision to consult a lawyer specializing in family law about legal options to protect our family against additional damage caused by Helena, and especially to establish formal documentation that could be used defensively in case she eventually followed through on her threat to involve Child Protective Services authorities based on false accusations that could trigger traumatic official investigations, even being completely unfounded. Julia, Fernando, the situation you've described clearly constitutes malicious defamation through substantial false statements made deliberately to third parties with the intention of harming reputation, and especially creates real risks of additional harm if Helena follows through on her threat to contact Child Protective Services authorities, because official investigations are routinely initiated based on anonymous reports, even when they end up being completely unfounded after a complete investigation, Dr. Mauricio, our lawyer, explained with professional seriousness during the initial consultation. My recommendation would be to prepare a formal cease and desist letter demanding that Helena immediately stop making any additional statements about you to third parties, and especially meticulously document the entire defamation campaign, including identification of all people contacted and specific content of false allegations made to each one, because that documentation will be crucial if we eventually need to defend against official investigations or sue Helena for damages caused through her deliberate malicious actions. The following weeks were dedicated to implementing a multifaceted legal strategy, combining a formal cease and desist letter, exhaustive documentation of the defamation campaign, and especially preparation of preventive defense in case Child Protective Services authorities were eventually contacted by Helena based on continuation of false accusations, despite formal legal warnings. Simultaneously, I continued executing the reputational damage control plan by systematically visiting all 12 identified people, presenting objective evidence, and requesting help in correcting rumors that had already begun circulating through informal community communication networks. The devastating experience of discovering that my own mother had executed a systematic defamation campaign designed to destroy my maternal reputation through elaborate personalized lies permanently transformed my understanding about the nature of family relationships and especially about the vulnerability of personal reputations to malicious attacks from close people who possess privileged access to intimate details of private lives that can be distorted and weaponized against innocent victims. 3 months after the initial discovery of Helena's defamation campaign at Mariana's house, the situation finally reached some level of partial resolution when Helena was diagnosed with late-onset delusional disorder possibly related to growing social isolation after recent retirement, and especially progressive cognitive deterioration affecting her ability to distinguish between objective reality and distorted paranoid interpretations of observed situations. The psychiatric diagnosis offered partial explanation for such bizarre behavior, but didn't completely eliminate moral responsibility for damages caused, or especially didn't completely undo the rumors that had already spread through the neighborhood during months of systematic campaign before being finally interrupted through coordinated legal and medical interventions. The decision about allowing future contact between Helena and my children after appropriate psychiatric treatment remained a complex issue that required careful balancing between family compassion and especially protecting Gabriel and Sophia against additional exposure to a person who had demonstrated disturbing capacity to cause psychological harm through manipulations even when allegedly motivated by distorted concern about their well-being. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was recognizing warning signs about systematic defamation campaigns executed by close people who possess privileged access to private information, sudden changes in visitation patterns without prior notice, excessive interest in photographing everyday situations that could later be distorted out of context, and especially apparently innocent comments about concerns that are never discussed directly with the supposedly problematic person, but rather shared exclusively with third parties through private conversations that gradually build defamatory narratives without appropriate contradiction that would allow clarifications and corrections of misunderstandings before they solidify into collective convictions based on distorted unilateral information. The morning following that initial discovery about Helena's systematic campaign brought cruel clarity that made it impossible to continue denying the complete magnitude of reputational damage already inflicted through 3 months of methodically executed defamation, while I remained completely unconscious about the progressive destruction of my maternal image before an entire community that had learned to trust and respect me during 5 years of peaceful coexistence and good neighborhood relationships carefully built through genuine daily interactions. Gabriel and Sophia woke up that morning with innocent questions about why Grandma Helena hadn't visited during recent days, considering she normally appeared at least twice a week bringing candy and toys, while secretly executing systematic observations she later maliciously distorted, transforming normal family moments into fabricated evidence of serious neglect to present dramatically to credulous neighbors who had no prior reason to question narratives from an apparently concerned grandmother, sharing legitimate anguish about vulnerable grandchildren's well-being. "Mommy, is Grandma Helena mad at us about something we did wrong? She always comes to visit us, but it's been a long time since she's been here at home and we miss her," Sophia asked, with that devastating innocence characteristic of an 8-year-old child who understood absolutely nothing about complex adult manipulations, but instinctively felt when important family relationships were being inexplicably broken through decisions made by adults in contexts that remained completely opaque to limited childish comprehension. Sophia's simple question broke my heart because it revealed that the true victims of that impossible situation were not just Fernando and I facing serious reputational damage through a malicious defamation campaign, but especially 2 innocent children who were losing a relationship with a grandmother they genuinely loved, despite her having demonstrated disturbing capacity to cause psychological suffering through elaborate lies designed to destroy her own daughter's reputation for motivations I still couldn't fully understand even after weeks of obsessive reflection, trying to identify rational explanations for such bizarrely cruel behavior. How to explain to 8-year-old children that the grandmother who always treated them with superficial affection was simultaneously spreading horrible lies about their mother through the entire neighborhood, alleging serious maternal negligence that put child well-being at risk? How to protect childhood innocence while simultaneously preparing them for the possibility of prolonged or permanent separation from a family member who had been a constant presence in their lives since birth. The impossible parental questions accumulated, creating crushing weight of responsibility about making correct decisions that balanced appropriate honesty with protection of healthy emotional development during an extraordinarily difficult period that would inevitably affect the children's understanding about adult trustworthiness, and especially about disturbing complexities of family relationships that can be simultaneously loving on the surface and profoundly toxic in hidden underlying dynamics. My loves, Grandma Helena is going through a difficult time where she needs special help from doctors to resolve some health problems that affect how she thinks and feels about things, so we won't be able to see her for some time until she gets better. I explained carefully, choosing words that were simultaneously true in essence, but appropriately simplified for childish comprehension without exposing traumatic details about the specific nature of the diagnosed delusional disorder, or especially about the content of lies Helena had systematically spread about our family. The most important thing you need to understand is that Grandma loves you very much even when she's doing confusing things because of her health problems, and especially that you did absolutely nothing wrong to cause this complicated situation that happened between family adults. Gabriel and Sophia accepted my simplified explanation with that characteristic trust of children who haven't yet developed sufficient skepticism to deeply question narratives presented by parents they implicitly trust. But their expressive faces revealed genuine sadness about the prospect of being temporarily separated from a grandmother who had been a constant presence and especially a source of treats and special attention that children naturally adore receiving from indulgent grandparents. After Gabriel and Sophia left for school, accompanied by Fernando, who had taken on the responsibility of driving them personally during that sensitive period, instead of allowing them to walk the usual 3 blocks alone, due to concerns about possible uncomfortable encounters with neighbors who had been exposed to Helena's defamatory narratives, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen observing the morning sun filtering through white curtains, creating comforting light patterns on the wooden table where so many joyful family meals had been shared during 5 years of peaceful life in that community that now seemed irreversibly contaminated by suspicions and judgments based on elaborate lies. The solitude of that moment finally provided the opportunity to emotionally process the entire impossible sequence of events that had dramatically exploded into my previously tranquil life, transforming a comfortable family routine into a reputational damage control nightmare that consumed every waking hour through obsessive worries about how many additional people beyond the 12 identified had been exposed to Helena's narratives through secondary rumor dissemination. The phone rang, interrupting my moment of solitary reflection, and upon answering, I immediately recognized the tense voice of Ricardo, my neighbor from across the street, whom Helena had specifically mentioned contacting during her defamation campaign. "Julia, I need to talk to you about something extremely uncomfortable that happened last night after I found out through Carmen about the situation with your mother spreading false stories throughout the neighborhood." Ricardo began with a tone loaded with evident embarrassment about a subject he clearly would have preferred to avoid completely, but which his conscience compelled him to discuss despite substantial personal discomfort. "Yesterday afternoon, I received a call from a woman identifying herself as a social worker from Child Protective Services, claiming to have received an anonymous report about possible neglect involving children residing at your address, and requesting permission to speak with me as a close neighbor who could provide independent observations about family conditions at your house." Ricardo's words confirmed my worst nightmare. Helena had apparently followed through on her threat to contact official authorities despite the formal legal cease and desist letter that had been delivered a week earlier, clearly establishing the legal consequences of continuing to make false accusations. The instant panic that overtook my mind upon hearing confirmation that an official Child Protective Services investigation had been initiated, based on an anonymous report obviously originating from Helena, was absolutely paralyzing in its devastating intensity. Even if the investigation eventually concluded that the allegations were completely unfounded after an objective examination of evidence, the simple fact of being investigated by child protection authorities would create a permanent stigma that would follow our family indefinitely through official records, and especially through inevitable rumors that would spread exponentially once neighbors discovered that social workers were conducting interviews about possible neglect in our home. "Ricardo, what exactly did you respond when the social worker contacted you requesting information about our family?" I asked with a voice that visibly trembled from a mixture of fear about possible devastating consequences and especially growing anger about Helena having maliciously escalated the situation to a level that could result in permanent psychological trauma for Gabriel and Sophia if they were eventually interviewed by official authorities about family living conditions during the investigative process. Julia, I told the social worker exactly that. During 5 years observing your family as a close neighbor, I never witnessed any indication of neglect or inadequate treatment of Gabriel and Sophia. That on the contrary, they always seemed to be exceptionally well cared for and happy children living in a clearly loving and stable family environment. And especially that I had recently learned through other neighbors about a systematic defamation campaign executed by your mother, apparently based on a psychological disorder that distorted interpretations of normal everyday situations, transforming them into serious allegations, completely disconnected from objectively observable reality, Ricardo explained with reassuring firmness. Additionally, I informed her that at least 10 other neighbors had been similarly contacted by your mother with fabricated narratives, and that after presentations of objective evidence by you and Fernando, we had all concluded that the allegations were manifestly false and motivated by the complainant's mental health issues rather than legitimate concerns based on factual observations about the children's actual living conditions. Ricardo's response offered some temporary relief that at least one neighbor had vigorously defended our family during the interview with authorities instead of simply passively repeating the defamatory narratives he had initially heard from Helena before understanding the fabricated nature of the allegations. Immediately after hanging up with Ricardo, I urgently called Dr. Mauricio, our attorney, informing him about the alarming development involving the anonymous report to Child Protective Services, and especially requesting guidance on how to proceed strategically to minimize damages during the inevitable investigative process that had now been officially triggered through Helena's final malicious escalation, despite all previous legal warnings about the consequences of continuing to make false accusations. Julia, this development unfortunately confirms our worst fears about Helena being willing to maliciously escalate the situation, beyond simply spreading rumors through the neighborhood to the point of formally involving official authorities based on allegations she knows to be completely false. Dr. Mauricio responded with growing seriousness. I will immediately contact Child Protective Services, identifying myself as the family's legal representative, and offering complete cooperation with the investigation, while simultaneously providing a comprehensive dossier of prior documentation, including the cease and desist letter sent to Helena, medical and financial evidence categorically refuting specific allegations, and especially testimonies from multiple neighbors confirming the fabricated nature of accusations originated from a person diagnosed with a delusional disorder that affects perception of objective reality. The following 48 hours were a period of absolute anxiety awaiting official contact from the social worker assigned to conduct the investigation into the anonymous report that Helena had maliciously filed despite complete knowledge about the falsity of the allegations and especially about the psychological damages the investigation would cause Gabriel and Sophia, regardless of the eventual conclusion about the unfounded nature of the accusations. Fernando had to take days off work to remain available in case authorities decided to conduct an unannounced home visit, which is standard procedure in cases of reports about acute neglect requiring immediate verification of child safety conditions. We especially organized all previously compiled documentation in an accessible format allowing efficient presentation of objective evidence, systematically refuting each specific allegation that Helena had made during months of defamatory campaign culminating in that final official report. Fernando's suggestion about criminally prosecuting my own mother for false reporting represented a dramatic escalation beyond the civil defamation measures we had initially considered. But after weeks facing devastating consequences of Helena's systematic campaign of lies culminating in a traumatic official investigation by child protection authorities, previous emotional resistance about transforming a family conflict into a criminal case had been completely exhausted through justified anger about damages caused not only to me, but especially to Gabriel and Sophia. They had been subjected to invasive interviews by a social worker investigating serious allegations about parental neglect that should never have been made by a person who claimed to genuinely love them. Fernando, I completely agree that we need to take more severe measures to ensure Helena doesn't continue causing additional damages through repeated false reports or other forms of harassment designed to traumatize our family indefinitely. I responded with growing conviction, finally overcoming previous emotional ambivalence about criminally prosecuting my own mother. Call Dr. Mauricio now and request that he prepare a formal criminal complaint, including all the documentation we've compiled about the systematic defamation campaign, and especially Dr. Beatrice's report confirming the complete lack of foundation of the allegations made in the anonymous report that obviously originated from Helena, considering the specific content corresponds exactly to narratives she had spread previously throughout the neighborhood during preceding months. During the following weeks, while Dr. Mauricio prepared a comprehensive criminal complaint against Helena for multiple offenses, including malicious defamation and false reporting to authorities, I focused my energies on gradually rebuilding a sense of family normalcy that had been completely destroyed through months of constant stress, dealing with the consequences of the defamation campaign, and especially through the trauma of the invasive official investigation that had profoundly affected both Fernando and me, and especially Gabriel and Sofia, who had been forced to answer uncomfortable questions from the social worker about intimate aspects of family life. Resuming comforting daily routines like regular family dinners, weekly game nights, and especially weekend outings to local parks provided some appearance of restored normalcy, but the family atmosphere remained subtly altered through residual anxiety about the possibility of Helena continuing to cause problems through new false reports or other forms of malicious harassment, even after formal legal proceedings were initiated establishing severe legal consequences for persistently harmful behavior. The dramatic turnaround that finally brought definitive resolution to that impossible saga arrived 6 weeks after the child protection investigation, when Helena was hospitalized emergently, after a suicide attempt apparently motivated by a distorted perception that the entire extended family had conspired against her through unjust legal proceedings designed to silence her legitimate attempts to protect vulnerable grandchildren from a negligent mother. The news about Helena's emergency psychiatric hospitalization arrived through a nighttime call from my younger brother, Rodrigo, who lived in a different city but maintained occasional contact with our mother, despite a complicated relationship also characterized by years of emotional manipulations similar to those I had experienced during adult life. Julia? Mom is admitted to a psychiatric ward after being found unconscious in her apartment by a concerned neighbor who noticed accumulated mail at her door during 3 consecutive days and requested a welfare check by local authorities. Rodrigo explained with a voice loaded with complex emotion, mixing genuine concern about maternal health with frustration about destructive behavioral patterns that had progressively alienated all family members during years of calculated manipulations. The psychiatrist in charge said she was experiencing an acute psychotic episode where objective reality had been completely replaced by paranoid delusions about an elaborate family conspiracy designed to permanently separate her from her grandchildren, and especially to criminally punish her for simply trying to protect vulnerable children from a supposedly abusive home environment that existed exclusively in the distorted interpretations of her mind. The news about Helena's suicide attempt and subsequent emergency psychiatric hospitalization created an impossible emotional paradox, where part of me felt genuine compassion for a person clearly suffering through a severe mental disorder that fundamentally distorted perception of reality, causing intense psychological suffering through persistent paranoid delusions, while simultaneously, another part maintained justified anger about the devastating damages she had deliberately caused to my family through a systematic campaign of lies that culminated in a traumatic official investigation by child protection authorities based on a malicious false report. How to reconcile appropriate compassion for a sick person with the legitimate need to protect the family against potential future damages in case Helena's mental disorder was not adequately treated and monitored through appropriate medical and legal interventions. The question had no simple answer that would simultaneously satisfy conflicting moral obligations of family compassion and protection of the vulnerable. After consulting extensively with Dr. Mauricio and especially with the psychiatrist treating Helena during emergency hospitalization, Fernando and I made the decision to temporarily suspend criminal proceedings against Helena, conditioned on her accepting compulsory intensive psychiatric treatment, including appropriate medication for stabilization of her delusional disorder, regular therapy focused on recognition of perceptual distortions, and especially continuous medical supervision through weekly home visits by mental health professionals during a minimum probationary period of 2 years before any consideration about restoration of contact with Gabriel and Sofia. The mediated agreement was formalized through a court order clearly establishing specific conditions that Helena would need to satisfy to avoid imprisonment for false reporting, including complete compliance with prescribed psychiatric treatment, absolute cessation of any direct or indirect contact with our family, except through authorized legal channels, and especially a formal public retraction of the false allegations distributed to all people who had been exposed to the defamatory narratives during the systematic campaign executed during previous months. The retraction letter that Helena finally signed under supervision of her psychiatrist and attorney 3 months after initial hospitalization, when medication had finally stabilized the delusional symptoms, sufficiently allowing some recognition about the fabricated nature of the allegations. She had systematically made explicitly acknowledged that accusations about maternal negligence had been based on distorted interpretations of normal everyday situations caused by severe psychological disorder, rather than factual observations about the real living conditions of Gabriel and Sophia. The retraction was formally sent to all 12 people initially identified by Mariana as having been contacted during the defamation campaign, including Carmen, Ricardo, and other neighbors who had been exposed to the elaborate false narratives, requesting explicit apologies for the damages caused and primarily clarifying that Julia and Fernando were exceptionally dedicated parents, providing a completely healthy and appropriate family environment for children who were obviously well cared for and deeply loved, as any objective observer could confirm through casual interactions with the family during years of residence in the community. The gradual process of reputational reconstruction through distribution of Helena's formal retraction, combined with continuation of proactive communication efforts with the neighborhood about objective truth, eventually resulted in substantial restoration of community relationships that had been severely damaged during months of circulating rumors based on defamatory narratives originally spread by Helena, through persuasive private conversations with credulous neighbors who had no prior reason to question the concerns of an apparently genuine grandmother about the welfare of vulnerable grandchildren. Carmen became an especially vocal ally, publicly defending our family whenever she heard residual comments about old allegations, patiently explaining to other less informed neighbors about the completely fabricated nature of the original accusations, and primarily about the diagnosed delusional disorder that had caused Helena to distort interpretations of normal situations, transforming benign everyday aspects into imaginary evidence of serious neglect that never objectively existed outside the distorted perceptions of her sick mind. 1 year after initial discovery of the defamation campaign at Mariana's house, family life had finally returned to a reasonable appearance of restored normalcy, where Gabriel and Sophia attended school happily, without residual anxiety about possible discrimination, based on old rumors that had been largely dissipated through coordinated efforts of multiple neighbors clarifying the truth to the broader community. Fernando and I had rebuilt maternal reputations that had been temporarily destroyed through systematic lies, now universally recognized as fabrications motivated by mental illness rather than legitimate concerns based on factual observations. And primarily, the constant anxiety about Helena causing additional damage had been substantially reduced through a combination of supervised compulsory psychiatric treatment and court order establishing severe consequences, including immediate imprisonment if she violated conditions specifically outlined in the formally mediated agreement. The question about eventually allowing supervised contact between Helena and Gabriel and Sophia remained open pending sustained demonstration of mental stability through consistent compliance with treatment during the complete probationary period, and primarily the willingness of the children themselves to potentially rebuild a relationship with the grandmother who had caused so much suffering to the family, even though not intentionally due to mental illness compromising judgment and perception of objective reality. During family therapy session that we had initiated immediately after child protection investigation to help Gabriel and Sophia process traumatic experiences through appropriate interventions conducted by specialized pediatric psychologists, my children expressed understandable ambivalence about the prospect of meeting Helena again after a year of complete separation during her intensive psychiatric treatment. Mom, if Grandma Helena is better now because of the medicines that doctors gave her, does that mean she won't do bad things anymore that hurt you and Dad? Gabriel asked with that impressive capacity children have to identify essential questions, cutting through unnecessary adult complexities to reach the fundamental core of practical concerns about family emotional safety. The simple question revealed that Gabriel had intuitively understood the connection between Helena's mental illness and destructive behaviors that had caused so much suffering. But primarily it demonstrated legitimate anxiety about whether medical treatment would be sufficient to prevent future recurrences of harmful manipulations if contact were eventually restored under appropriate supervision. My love, the doctors who are taking care of Grandma Helena say she's much better now after taking special medicines that help her brain work correctly without creating confused thoughts that made her believe things that weren't true about our family. I explained, choosing words carefully appropriate for the comprehension of a 9-year-old child that Gabriel had completed during the traumatic year we had gone through together, facing consequences of Helena's defamatory campaign. But even with Grandma getting better through medical treatment, Mom and Dad will always stay very alert to ensure that any future contact with her happens only in supervised situations where responsible adults are present protecting you in case she starts having confused thoughts again that make her say or do inappropriate things that could hurt our family again. The explanation offered appropriate honesty about the reality that chronic mental disorders require continuous management through sustained treatment and careful monitoring, rather than being simply definitively cured through temporary interventions, but simultaneously reassured Gabriel about there being adequate safeguards protecting him and Sophia against exposure to potentially harmful behaviors if Helena's illness wasn't completely controlled through medication and therapy. 18 months after Helena's initial hospitalization, the psychiatrist responsible for her treatment finally recommended a carefully structured attempt at gradual restoration of supervised contact with grandchildren, beginning with brief monthly visits in a neutral environment supervised by family therapist who could intervene immediately if Helena demonstrated signs of recurrence of delusional thoughts or manipulative behaviors that had characterized the period prior to diagnosis and appropriate treatment. The first supervised reunion was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the family therapist's office, equipped with a comfortable but clearly professional room including age, appropriate toys for children, and primarily discrete cameras, allowing complete documentation of interaction for later review by the therapeutic team evaluating Helena's progress and primarily safety of continuing to allow contact with vulnerable grandchildren, who had been indirectly traumatized through consequences of her defamation campaign against the mother they loved deeply. Gabriel and Sophia demonstrated evident nervousness during the trip to the family therapist's office, holding hands tightly while asking repeated questions about what exactly would happen during the first visit, and primarily about whether they would be forced to hug or demonstrate affection for Helena if they didn't feel comfortable doing so after a year and a half of complete separation, during which they had been repeatedly assured by Fernando and me that her absence was a necessary temporary protective measure until mental health was sufficiently stabilized through appropriate treatment. My loves, during today's visit, you don't need to do absolutely anything you don't feel completely comfortable doing, including hugs or physical demonstrations of affection if you prefer to simply talk while maintaining respectful distance, I reassured while parking in front of the building where the family therapist's office operated. The most important thing is that you be honest about your feelings rather than pretending emotions you're not really feeling just to please Grandma Helena or to avoid disappointing her. If she expects a warmer reception than you're prepared to offer after so long without seeing her. The initial supervised reunion was an emotionally complex experience where Helena clearly made tremendous efforts to maintain appropriate composure and primarily to avoid demonstrating any sign of distorted thoughts that could alarm the therapist supervising the interaction, or that primarily could frighten Gabriel and Sophia, who cautiously observed every word and gesture of hers, intuitively evaluating whether the grandmother they remembered from the earlier period was the same person sitting nervously in the office chair. After 18 months of intensive psychiatric treatment, Helena's first words directed at her grandchildren after prolonged separation were a simple but genuine apology about having caused problems for the family through confused thoughts she had before doctors helped her understand that her interpretations of observed situations didn't correspond to objective reality, but rather were distortions created by illness affecting brain function, causing erroneous perceptions about intentions and behaviors of people she genuinely loved, including primarily her own daughter Julia and adored grandchildren, Gabriel and Sophia. Gabriel, Sophia, Grandma is very, very sorry for having done things that caused sadness and confusion for you, and primarily for your mom and dad, during the period when I was sick, without knowing that thoughts I had about the family weren't true, but rather were created by a problem in the brain that doctors are now helping control through special medicines and regular conversations with therapists, Helena said with a voice choked by genuine emotion that contrasted dramatically with the cold, calculating tone that had characterized the earlier period when she executed the systematic defamation campaign, apparently without any remorse about damages caused. You don't need to forgive Grandma immediately or pretend that everything went back to being like it was before, because Grandma understands that she broke your trust through bad behaviors, even though it wasn't the intention to hurt anyone due to illness making the brain work incorrectly, creating distorted thoughts about normal situations. Helena's genuine humility during that first supervised reunion offered some hope about the eventual possibility of partial reconstruction of family relationship that had been severely damaged through months of malicious manipulations. But simultaneously, both Fernando and I remained cautious about maintaining realistic expectations, recognizing that chronic delusional disorders require continuous vigilance, and primarily that relapses always remain possible, especially during stressful periods that could destabilize the precarious mental balance maintained through medication and regular therapy. 2 years after initial discovery of the defamation campaign at Mariana's house, on that impossible afternoon that had triggered a devastating sequence of events completely transforming previously peaceful family life, I finally felt we had achieved a new stable equilibrium, characterized by community relationships restored through persistent efforts to clarify objective truth, maternal reputation rebuilt through consistent evidence of exceptional parenting demonstrated daily, through visibly happy and well-adjusted children thriving in a loving family environment, and primarily gradual acceptance of complex reality about Helena being simultaneously the person who had caused tremendous suffering through actions motivated by severe mental illness, and also being mother and grandmother, who genuinely loved family even when delusional disorder distorted perceptions, transforming love into destructive behaviors, based on paranoid interpretations completely disconnected from objective reality. The decision about maintaining limited supervised contact between Helena and my children instead of permanently cutting off the relationship reflected conscious choice to prioritize emotional well-being of Gabriel and Sophia, who clearly expressed desire to maintain some form of connection with grandmother despite past hurts, as long as appropriate safeguards remained established protecting against potential recurrences of manipulative behaviors if Helena's psychiatric treatment failed to completely control delusional symptoms underlying her diagnosed mental disorder. The devastating experience of discovering and facing consequences of systematic defamation campaign executed by my own mother permanently transformed my understanding about vulnerability of personal reputations to malicious attacks by close people who possess privileged access to intimate details of private lives that can be distorted and weaponized against innocent victims, but primarily taught valuable lessons about importance of responding proactively to false rumors through presentation of objective evidence, rather than simply ignoring hoping that truth will prevail automatically without active correction efforts. About necessity of establishing firm legal boundaries against persistent defamers, even when they're close relatives whose destructive behaviors may be motivated by mental disorders deserving compassion, but which don't eliminate responsibility for damages caused. And primarily about impressive resilience of families that face adversities through solidarity and unity, rather than allowing external attacks to create internal divisions amplifying initial damages caused by malicious or mentally ill people who attempt to destroy relationships through systematic lies designed to sow distrust and primarily to isolate victims from support systems that are fundamental to psychological well-being during periods of extraordinary crisis. Did you like Julia's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.